I don't think luck brings lasting fame. See, I don't mind not having GPS because I don't mind getting lost. I think it's kind of fun unless I'm desperately in a hurry. Then I suddenly wish I knew where I was going. But, somebody came up to me, and I was 17 right now, and they asked me would I really want to choose the life of a writer. I would have to pause on that.
This was another interview that we did right before COVID. Sven Birkerts is a essayist and a literary critic. He used the word attention a lot. He says that attention is so important, and we're losing attention and the core meaning of attention in the digital age. He has written quite a lot, but two of his books that we talked about in this interview, one was called The Gutenberg Elegies, that came out in the 90s. In 2015, I think he released a book called Changing the Subject. He is completely unafraid of the big subjects of life, and he approaches them in a way that is so human and yet incredibly intellectual and sophisticated. The conversation with him was really interesting to me, and I hope you enjoy it. So thank you for being a part of this.
With much pleasure, yes.
Your work has meant a lot to a lot of people. As a minor example, in late 2015, I began reading about new technology and neuroplasticity, the evidence that suggests we can alter the wiring of our brains to inhibit focus and experiences of richness and depth. Reading about these things brought me to your book, Changing the Subject, which we have handy. A month after reading it, I traded in my iPhone, which I'd had from 2011 to 2016, for the old model.
Okay, Robinson Crusoe here, yeah.
I've shared your work with many other people who have had similarly intense reactions and admit of a loss of consciousness that feels deep and unrecoverable. This brings me to my question. What is the nature of fame in your medium? Does conveying truth, resonating truth, guarantee any sort of widespread recognition at all, or make anonymity more likely? In short, why aren't you famous?
Okay. Well, I said your overall topic was provocative. It was, for whatever reason, in the last day or two, just driving around doing this and that, I have been questioning the idea of fame. And I realized that the first thing, I would have to do, just the way my mind works, is to break it down. So distinguish between, fame, reputation, posterity, fame as a cultural phenomenon versus fame as it has mostly been known up until fairly recent times as an ongoingness of one's name and reputation. Then I thought, well, of course, there's so many gradations too, because you have people who are enormously famous in their cohort, whether it's something in the sciences and everyone who's a scientist is like in awe, but the man on the street has no idea. Then there's the flash fame, somebody will do something that captures wide attention, will bask in that for a while, but as somebody who worked in bookstores, both used and rare and new, for years and years, one thing that quickly gets realized is how names that were big 10 years ago are just piled in a corner, gathering proverbial dust, and it's very fickle. I think it's always been fickle even before the arrival of, digital media. Luck brings many people fame of a short-term variety. I don't think luck brings lasting fame. But contrary-wise, I don't think that talent necessarily ends up in the camp of fame. I wish I could say with complete faith that anything that's really good will finally win out. I just don't think history is quite telling us. Though there are those weird, and they're fairly constant, but sort of inexplicable discoveries and rediscoveries. I mean, nobody was sort of literarily more famous and notorious than, say, Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer in our times has, at least in terms of public consumption and reference and all those things that keep a name going, Norman's kind of taking a nap now. So it'll be a question of what comes back, if it comes back. It's sort of fairly deeply saturated with a certain kind of misogyny of its times, and that'll be a hard comeback.
He's one of my favorite writers.
Yeah,
but
no,
I can't even. I hesitate to even say it because you're right. It's very, it's controversial, right? And he is controversial, or maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and also the tones of different eras change, and a great world-class writer like D.H. Lawrence, who was just everywhere throughout the late '60s, early '70s, is one of the great masters of contemporary novel. He's dropped. And so, I see how it works in a bookstore. First, the big stack gets sort of winnowed, so you keep a couple of the chestnuts there in case someone's looking, and then you start moving them aside when, the new whatever comes in. And but that's, this is fame, small f. I think what you're in a way wanting to get at is also fame, capital F. With the idea, I guess, up until fairly recently, and maybe the marker really is digital culture. I think we all lived with a concept of a sort of basic, sound, viable posterity. You'd have your ups and downs, but there was this posterity by which you would be known, evaluated, commented on, and you'd find your sort of water table and be, either remain for posterity or not. I think what this stuff has now done, it has really atomized the idea of posterity as it has atomized many other things.
Okay, so let's discuss that.
Yeah.
Do you think that the flourishing of new media, in some sense also, that there is a certain meritocracy to it, in that deep ideas do actually travel far on, say, YouTube, or, I don't know if you're on social media, I doubt it, but...
I'm on Twitter and Instagram.
So just, a little bit dabbling.
Yeah.
But, there's like memes and things on these channels, okay? Mm-hmm. And some of them, are human experience just reflected in a very small little, it's an insight that may have been in the middle of a deep novel that has been extracted and slapped on a bite-sized sort of thing. And those tend to go way further because people have almost a literary reaction to them.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me. And, I'm going to come back to that word deep that you raised earlier, but also I'm certainly aware of those extracted, nuggets that you say, aha. I think with the phenomenon of those nuggets is also a kind of nuggeting of attention. So you remark it for a moment, but honestly, unless you write it down or preserve it, it is back in the flow and you have no idea, not only because there's so much coming, but also because the nature of interacting with that flow is a pretty steady, very short-term memory and a vast forgetfulness, because you couldn't otherwise carry all this stuff,
Okay, so let me come at it like this then. So I'm trying to find if it's just doom, okay, or if there's some pearls, right? So what if you were a filmmaker, let's say 20 or 25 years ago, and you had an idea that would just calcify and sort of wither, and you would have an internal kind of pain where it died, and that would be it. Now you can be your own producer, director, distributor, and creativity can find an outlet, whereas before it would be subject to the time and attention of one of 20 or 30 people who can make that decision, right? Do these things offer some hope in any sense? I mean, is there these channels, like I think about the example you gave in where you're introduced to Virginia Woolf through the very thing that is eradicating our appreciation
right.
of it, right? So is there some relationship in new media that resembles that?
Actually, I don't put a huge amount of trust in that. I think the two things that the media, essentially, this particular kind of media attacks is attention and memory, those two things. And I think everything that we're talking about in terms of lastingness and so on is completely contingent on memory and attention. I think when you came in, when we started talking, and you said that, reading certain things had sort of persuaded you to move backward in a way, and I don't mean that I don't really believe people will ever give up the whole host of their devices, but I think I hear quite a lot of the people in my particular cohort and generation trying out various ways of backing away from something that they were much farther in, and they've realized it's not a source of happiness, or a word that should be thrown in here is the word anxiety. I think one of the consequences of this is there's a low-grade permanent anxiety, and it is, not just fear of missing out, but it's something almost neural. You get caught up in the rhythms of how quickly things come, how many links there are, and you're always thinking you might be missing the right one, the good thing. And I think it creates this sense of a lack of any kind of real closure in terms of your interaction with it. It's just ongoing, and some things you react to are great, they're interesting, they're fascinating. Huge amount of trash, so much negligible, I mean, life's always been full of marketing and trash and billboards that are stupid and paintings that are great. But I think a different pace and a different kind of interaction allowed people to sort of find a way around it more easily than when it's doing this, just racing at you.
It shows up in my life definitely, even though I have this and still, I have an iPad, I have business, it's racing at you, and there is a numbing quality and a painful quality because you don't know why you can't figure it out. You're scrolling and you're looking for something. Who knows what they're looking for? They're just going, and you don't know what you're looking for, but you keep going. But
also it creates that. I'm just sorry, I'm jumping in, but when I'm not on, when I'm away for a while, I'm not wanting it. It's only when I'm actually entering the grid of it all that I find it very hard to quickly detach. And it's because of that sense of something's just around the next little bend there, So
to be a writer was to position oneself at an angle to society. It was to live in a different and possibly dangerous way in service of a vision. Or some Gutenberg elegies. Is there any way this could be achieved through new mediums at all? I mean, you have a phrase that changed the subject, which has always stuck with me, the pure vibration of resonance. And so if anybody who's a deep reader, you understand what this means. I mean, it hits you, and it's something that you knew was true, but you didn't articulate. And it hits you, and you can't, but you want to tell 10 other people and show that, so is this vibration possible online? Can the durability and impact of prose that stands for a vision be translated, or are we going to lose it forever?
Again, I'm not optimistic on the digital front, because especially if you're talking about a writer being positioned at an angle to the culture, I think once you log on, once you step into the system, there's no angle to be found, really.
This is sort of like perception that you're a little bit of a snob, or a little bit of
you're trying to be cool.
You're
trying to be at an angle to everyone else.
And which is crazy because I'm downgrading to, but it's a more humbling thing to walk around with this. It's not like you feel cool,
right?
But I guess I'm trying to find out if there's any, this thing has given a lot of creative people a shot at a good life.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to find out how that figures into it. Okay, and I'll be honest with you. When I read your work, I don't want to do any of this stuff. I want to be alone in a cabin and write, and that's it. And that's how I want to, I want to be in that happy, reclusive sort of idleness that you talk about. Right, idleness is a word that you've used.
But let me ask you, since you just said a lot of creative people have gotten great benefit out of this. Have they gotten great creative benefit or just great publicity benefit of broadcasting their product?
I don't know.
Because I'm trying to imagine somebody doing something, powerful and lasting. Well, I guess, obviously certain...
I mean, there's film.
There's film for sure. And there's music composition. I guess there are ways. I don't know if for the writing end of things that works the same way. Are you looking for just the overall in this series? Are you looking for any comfort and consolation?
I guess. No. I'm just curious, honestly, what you really think, because you have thought about these subjects a lot longer and deeper than I have. So I guess I am looking for the. I think I take some consolation in that I would have had to have been. At another time to support my writing habit, I would have had to have had some sales job to support.
Right.
And I can now make creative videos, and that is, it's enthralling to me. And it takes me out of myself. And,
sure.
And you're in the world, and so that's a natural embankment against all the craziness of this circular writer's life. So for those reasons, I find it consoling. On the other hand, I don't know if it's a trick. I don't know if we're making anything that's
Yeah. Well, I asked this because I'm going on the light side a little, according to my deeper thoughts, and this is in part because after the Gutenberg thing came out, I had a couple of years where I was, moderately narrowly famous around that subject. So I went around to different places. I was always on panels and being questioned inevitably about, was this all gloom and doom or, and I'd always have to, because of the nature of crowd pressure, I'd always be looking for, on the other hand, I still have hope that, kind of thing. And that became almost a structural thing in terms of public delivery. Deep down, I don't think art, the deeper spirit of art, the kind of art that moves a person as opposed to stimulating them, I don't think it has much connection with the digital, in part because the digital is public, and I still think that, the sources of art, essentially, leaving collaboration to one side, are private, The stuff comes up out of distilled private experience, which takes a while to get distilled, like good whiskey. It doesn't. You don't see something immediately come up with a great artistic product reflecting that.
You have to go away.
You live with it, but you can't live with it if you're constantly, doing this. You got to live with it in the other ways too. Just carry it and not have it. Be constantly deflected and interrupted by everything else that's going on.
What do you ever feel that the private side is too much?
Yeah. Actually, that's one reason, because I sort of stepped down from directing this writing program at Bennington two Junes ago. And I went from being constantly occupied and busy with people, teaching, and all that, to so I came home, and there was a kind of weird implosion, of it's not just that you glide from that into immediately day one picking up your pen and taking up the great work you've been contemplating. No, you go into a kind of inner panic because suddenly there's time. The kids leave home, there's time. You leave a major job, there's more time. So for me, it's very essential. You asked about, going into Agni and stuff. I do that 5 days a week, and I do it in large part because given our technology, I can do a huge amount of it here if I chose. But when I go in there, I see people, I interact, stuff comes up, and it takes care of that too muchness. Because if I just got up and stayed in my, PJs, so to speak, all day, and that wouldn't work. I'd get depressed. Too much solitude creates a sort of brooding, light depression, which I'm quite fond of. It's my personality, but a little goes, you don't want it all the time. I was thinking about this yesterday. I said I was in New York and driving back. We're in my wife's car, and it's a Hyundai, but it's fixed up with all of the signals. If someone's coming on your left, you hear a beep, and if you're too close, you hear a beep, and if you turn the lane without signaling. And then, meanwhile, and again, I don't use GPS, but she does, and so we were traveling with GPS to try to get out of New York, and I suddenly realized I'm not doing anything. I'm not in the world. I'm obeying the beeps, and I'm obeying the voice and watching the arrow. So what's that about? It's a small thing, but there are many things of that ilk. Whether it's getting your groceries delivered.
Put you on autopilot.
Yeah, whatever. It's just the friction. I have written about that a little bit, but, even the difference between, and again, that's why I see myself as a kind of cusp age group, because I had maybe 30 years on one side and the remainder on the other so far. So I can remember, going to the bank and standing in line and all those things that are now have been apped out or are about to be, parking, around the block 100 times, whereas now apparently just tells you where to go, where there's a free, all of that's about friction, and I think friction is integral to feeling our boundaries, where we stop and the world picks up. But when there aren't those, everything's just kind of loopy and fluid with very little demarcation. It's actually hard to get that grip, this is me. And so I always have the fantasy of what happens to your basic modern 21st century citizen who suddenly has to spend a couple days in the woods out of range of any of this stuff. I think the silence is scary. I think it gets scary. I think people, it's not that they're scared of anything out there, it's they're scared of the what do I do now-ness. And, they're scared of the fact that suddenly it's just them. See, I don't mind not having GPS because I don't mind getting lost. I think it's kind of fun unless I'm desperately in a hurry. Then I suddenly wish I knew where I was going. But, that's the risk.
Do you have a clear head?
In what sense?
Well, like none of us really do. So I'm wondering if whatever you put in place to fight this stuff has cleared your head, or do you feel like you're a victim of it?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm so enmeshed in all of it, but I have this persistent and growing hatred of systems, which is increasingly defining me, because I will so often, if I'm asked to go through some set of digital hoops for something to happen, I won't do it, or I'll get on the phone and yell at somebody and say, and that's sort of beginning to dictate. It's like, I'm not going to do that just because I can't stand the actions I have to perform in order to then insert myself in that particular system. But a certain amount you just can't avoid. It's baked in, I suppose, into the structure of our modern culture, and you become an idiot fighting certain things too hard. But
writers need an idea, or a writer needs an idea to be a writer. If you had lived through a different time, what would your subject be?
I think some parts would be the same. I think if all this hadn't happened, I think I would stay closer to, literary and personal essay. But this kind of took over at a certain point. And what's interesting, because there's also the question of luck versus, that you've done something that really matters or whatever. I can see now how much this came about as a, merging of forces. One of them was just, I guess the instigation was my noticing things that people didn't seem to be remarking. And you asked about like the essay, and there's no getting around it. The essay it's a glorious but very minor form, at least in the terms of public consumption. Probably for many reasons, but part of it is that everyone goes through the particular structure of the school system, and it's the kind of, now we're going to study the essay. It's always some, boring thing, and people associate essay, oh God. So
we were talking about how you could be in a certain pod, I think it was the word you used, a vertical, where you're the lowercase f for that, and then everybody who's the scholars of that world review.
Yeah.
And you've obviously far surpassed that distinction. I can't remember where I was reading it, but there was someone opened their book by saying, we don't realize that before this stuff happened, you were in a small town, and there was the one guy in town who was the greatest actor, the one guy in town who was the greatest pianist, and the one guy in town who made the best cake, and so
right.
And so in some weird way, this era of fractionating, maybe is pushing us toward that sort of idea of local heroes again.
That would be a lovely thought. Yeah, I mean, you just wonder, and I don't see any immediate answer to this, but whether at some level, cultural, genetically, we are born with an ingrown sense of things that feel right and good, possibly because they've been established as norms for millennia or whatever it is. Whether those be the simple, basic pleasures of a certain kind of social life or a certain amount of whatever. That's all been scrambled now. And if I put any faith in anything, it is that there will come a turning against it again point,
This is from Gutenberg Elegies again. I was sure that things far greater than mere literary journalism lay in store. I hold the camera on that disaffected young man, that bundle of spiky attitudes. I can read the pose, the telltale mannerisms. Indeed, I see it reproduced year after year in certain of the students I teach. I look out from the front of the room, note the hunched shoulders, the drifting gaze, the ever so slightly mocking inflection at the corners of the mouth. And though I should know better, I feel judged by it. That arrogance of youth, that narcissistic conviction that one's life will be better, more interesting, than the lives of the defeated adults who populate the world. I remember it all so clearly. But while I can say that was me just 20 years ago, I still feel triggered. I want them to see me as an exception. I want them to approve of the choices I made. I want them to know, too, that those choices never present themselves as we, flush with omnipotence, imagine they will. Now, I've been the arrogant student, obviously, and maybe that's where I'm at. I don't know. I've had a certain number of failures, so I can begin to empathize with the feeling of the defeated adult. I guess what I want to ask you is whether you're still tempted to look at things through this framework, whether the joy of your work when it's going well has been the primary reward, or whether other things have mattered more.
Even within the sphere of the literary, not whether family has mattered more or children,
Yes.
but the other
Yes.
stuff. I won't say that some of the other stuff didn't matter. I mean, one of the things that, and it was a consequence of writing and publishing and having a certain amount of good luck in that. But it did bring along in its way, I got to know, a great many rather phenomenal people. Whether it was Joseph Brodsky or Seamus Heaney. I got to know these guys, and it's like, I wouldn't have if I hadn't been in that sphere. But that's not the main thing. No, it really is, I guess, top of the list, or the star on it, is the sensation of genuinely being in the grip of something that as you're doing it is working and is good. I mean, to me, there's no better sensation when you just keep going and you know you're going to look back and you're not going to trash it, which is not always true. But, you know, sometimes those golden moments, those are great. Almost enough, but what drives them is ambition also. And part of the ambition is imagining people reading what you've written and responding and, you know, valuing you in a certain way. But, you know, it's like the old, well, if you could go back and choose something else, what would you choose? I think if I could go back and choose it at the time I was in, I would choose it. If somebody came up to me and I was 17 right now and they asked me would I really want to choose the life of a writer, and if I thought the way I do now as a 60-something-year-old man, I would have to pause on that, just because I think the importance of it has not in any way shrunk. The place for it, I mean the private importance, the place for it in a public arena has. Because there's no longer that same kind of public reverence for things cultural. And that would be signaled by, you know, Time magazine routinely putting composers and writers and artists on the cover and sort of messaging the culture saying, this stuff's important. There's John Updike or there's, you know, whoever. There's nothing signaling that anymore. As far as I can see, you know. So there I'm a bummer again.
An insightful bummer. Thanks for having us into your home.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it. And thanks, you know, obviously this stuff meant the world to me, so I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
No, actually, I love this kind of talk, so this was no exertion on that front.